Okay, so I'm just going to launch in here. We're running a bit behind our intended schedule, so I may fly through a bunch of this stuff. So this is more about this section is more about screen addiction and video games. So this is a quote from a guy named Justin Rosenstein. He is the creator of the like button. And he said, it's very common for humans to develop things with the best of intentions and for them to have unintended negative consequences. So what we've got going on in Western society, and actually most of the world, I mean, more people have a smartphone than a working toilet. So is this massive experiment on the human race. We've never had access to devices like these 24/7 with access to the internet and everything that's on it. So this presentation will be about some of the things that we're finding out about. So if you talk about our brains and how we're built, we're driven for three basic things. We're driven to connect. We're social beings. We're driven things that are stimulating, and we're driven by novelty. And all of these are things that help us make our way in the world when they're all there for a good reason. But in Western society, we've been focusing on these two here on the right-hand side, stimulation and novelty, more and more and more, to the exclusion of actual connection. And people may say, well, we're the most connected society ever with social media, but I'll get to that in a minute, and unfortunately it doesn't actually count. So dopamine is going to be the next topic. So dopamine's a brain transmitter, and it's all about desire for things. So this is what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's really important. If you didn't have it, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. This is what causes you to get up and have breakfast and go to work. But we can increase our dopamine by doing various things. So I've got a chart here. So if you click on the clicker, hopefully I'll get some dopamine. There we go. So if you have some chocolate, your dopamine level will rise by 50%. Yay. If you have sex, your dopamine level will double. And that's roughly close to the limit you can do with a natural, in a natural way. If you take cocaine, your dopamine level will rise by 350%. And something like P, can raise it by 1,250%. But the interesting thing to take away from this is the one down there on the bottom is that video games can also raise your dopamine level by the same amount as sex. So now we'll look at how this happens. So it's not just about how much is released, it's about how it's released. So if you have some food, like your chocolate, you get a little blip here after an hour, and then it slowly tails off. If you have a shot of nicotine, it goes up and it kind of tails off. Cocaine lands you way up here and it tails off. Sex is this yellow one here, and you see it goes up and it tails off gradually. But the problem with things like porn, which we were just talking about, is that it shoots up and then it just goes straight across, and we're looking here 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. So people with a serious porn addiction can maintain this kind of dopamine high for hour after hour. This is also true of video games. There are people who play Call of Duty for 18 hours straight, and so they get this massive dopamine high. So what we get here, one of the things to take away from this is that playing a violent video game is approximately equal to sex with respect to dopamine release. So powerful stuff. So I'm going to give you a really quick primer on addiction, if my clicker clicks. So how addiction happens is we like dopamine, but excessive release of dopamine actually will kill the neurons in our brain. So dopamine's a neural transmitter, so it jumps between the bits in your brain and it makes a connection. excessive release of dopamine actually can kill your neurons. So the neurons actually defend themselves by reducing the amount of dopamine receptors. So you could be producing the same amount of dopamine, but it's not actually doing anything for you anymore because your neurons are fending it off. So larger and larger releases of dopamine are needed to get the same effect. So that turns into longer amounts of time spending playing games or looking at pornography or on social media, and more extreme kind of content in your games and your porn. So this is a quote by the author of a book called Glow Kids. If you want to follow up with more reading on the screen addiction portion of this, I don't have these to sell today. This is my personal copy, but you can get this off Book Depository. Wealth of information. But as any neuroscientist can tell you, adrenaline and dopamine make for a potent and addictive combination. So the problem with video games and pornography is that they start mixing your brain chemicals. So there's things related to shame, aggression, adrenaline, and all these things. They create this cocktail that's even more potent than just straight dopamine. So I'll talk a little bit about how this affects young brains. So the greatest brain development occurs during childhood and early adolescence. The brain actually starts pruning itself about age 12, and the more important connections, it actually does this thing called myelination to make them stronger, so it makes super connections. So the strongest connections in your brain are those that are linked to the highest rewards. So if you have a 12-year-old child who plays video games 5 hours a day and generating a lot of dopamine, you're going to guess what are the strongest connections going to be in that brain, which ones are going to get myelinated and turned into these high-speed connections. So this is why it's very important for us to take this seriously with respect to children and adolescents. So addiction is actually an advanced form of learning. So when you repeat something that gives you a big reward, the more stimulating the reward, the stronger the learning is. So we begin to favor these rewards over the less stimulating ones, and we tend to do them over and over again. So we end up with this, that according to recent research, 90% of adults who are addicted to alcohol, tobacco, or drugs started using their addictive substance before they were 18. So when kids get addicted to things in these younger years, it can actually be more difficult for them to get rid of it later on. And so we have another quote here, that once new connections form, teen brains hold tightly to these associations. In fact, research shows that our most powerful and lasting memories arise from adolescence along with our worst habits. So that's your primer on addiction in the young brain. I'm going to jump into some social media stuff. So I argued that we're less connected, whereas a lot of people would argue that we're more connected because of social media. So I'm going to ask you a question, is what do these two things have in common? It's a bit of an oddity. I don't know if anybody would guess that one, but it's this thing we call variable reward. So there was some research done by a guy named B.F. Skinner in the 1950s, and he's kind of the father of putting rats in boxes and figuring and seeing what they do. So even the boxes are named after him, Skinner boxes. But he studied all these, giving rewards to rats, and he discovered this one he called the variable reward ratio, where the rewards are frequent but not regular. So if a rat does a certain behavior, it was given a reward, but it didn't always get the reward, but it frequently did. And this behavioral research showed that of all the different types of reward schedules he tried, like rewarding them all the time, rewarding them infrequently, that this particular one, this variable reward ratio, resulted in more occurrences of the desired behavior and resulted, he said in quotes, behaviors that are hard to extinguish. So variable reward ratio occurs in, it's a technique used in social media and all of our electronic devices, and it refers to email, texting, and social media. So you whip out your phone, and you check your device, there might be an interesting message for you. Somebody might have liked one of your posts, somebody might have contacted you, they might. And so this gets us checking our devices over and over again. So this is a quote from the first president of Facebook. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. He's no longer the president of Facebook. And this doesn't just apply to Facebook. I'll give you a short snippet from him in just a second. And this is another former VP of Facebook. The short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. No civil discourse, no cooperation, misinformation, mistruth. And it's not an American problem. This is not about Russian ads. This is a global problem. So this is just two of the people that were involved in early Facebook. There's also an early investor in Facebook that's come out and publicly apologized for investing in it. So this is that Sean Parker guy. If we've got audio here, I will just play a really short snippet of him. Okay, we're not getting audio. I may just have to, okay. We'll have to kill that one, but basically what he says, oh, now you've lost me. What he says in that video is that he and Mark Zuckerberg, the current president of Facebook and the creator of it, and all the people working there at the time, and some of the people in the other social media companies that they hung out with, like Instagram, they knew it was addictive, they designed it that way, and they did it on purpose. So that's what he says in that quote. But again, I'm running short on time, so I'll just paraphrase. So what we get here is that variable reward, this variable reward scheduling, is equal to dopamine. So this means that social media is truly addictive. So I'm just going to say, who else uses variable reward? I'm just going to throw a video game in here for those of you. I bet you lots of people will recognize this one. Minecraft. So kids mine for resources in order to build their structures in Minecraft. It is a variable reward schedule. So that's why Minecraft has been such a phenomenon and has grown so much, is that this technique is used in it. So addictions are related to, excuse me. So, we'll see. So texting can be addicting. So we know that. So they've done some research into it. So they define hypertexting as more than 200 texts per day. And US study says we can link that. It says that 20% of students hypertext. They're 200% as likely to have tried alcohol, 41% more likely to have used illegal drugs, 350% more likely to have had sex, 90% more likely to have had 4 or more sex partners. So this doesn't mean that texting causes that. It just means that these are people who are having impulse control issues, and that manifests in other parts of their lives. But of course, giving into impulse issues actually strengthens them, because as we talked earlier, using those pathways over and over again in your brain, producing the dopamine, strengthens them. So hypernetworking was also studied, so that's spending 3 or more hours on social media a day. So another US study says that's linked to depression, substance abuse, stress, poor sleep, poor academics, and suicide. In fact, there's one study that says that the more friends you have on Facebook, the more likely you are to be depressed. Direct connection. Doesn't mean it's causal, but so there's a great quote. There's an excellent TED talk that you can look up by this guy named Johan Hari about this thing called Rat Park. But one of the things that he said was the connections we think we have are like a parody of human connection. He says that if you have a crisis, it won't be your Twitter followers who come and sit with you. It'll be the flesh and blood friends. So another issue with social media is that we're influenced by those we hang out with. So if we hang out with 10 kids, if we're a kid and we hang out with 10 kids, and one of them smokes pot or has multiple sex partners, they might have some influence on us, but it'd probably be minimal. But on social media, we can hang out with 100 kids. That magnifies how common we perceive destructive behaviors to be. So 30 or 40 of those kids may be having sex or using drugs or alcohol. And things rapidly begin to seem normal that weren't a generation ago. And so some of the things that we've lost, just quickly, is experiencing life together. So we've all looked at the same funny YouTube video, but we didn't look at it together. I just forwarded it to you. Human touch is actually critical to our emotional health. Actual non-sexual physical touch. It generates something called endorphins. Another thing that makes us feel good. Eye contact is incredibly important. So there's some interesting people. I've got their book up here, and they've got a website called Joy Starts Here. They're a Christian group, but they do a lot of work around neuroscience, and they study joy. And they describe joy as the sense in somebody else's eyes that they're happy to see you. And they say that this sensation actually, through this process we call mirror neurons, travels back and forth 6 times a second. It doesn't actually happen over Skype or video conferencing. It's only something that happens in person. So when you lose eye contact, you're actually losing something really significant for your mental and emotional health. And there's a study of grade 8 to 11s that showed that only 35% of them socialize face-to-face anymore. I think that's, again, a US study. So it's important to know, too, when our kids, if we get frustrated with them getting hooked on these things, it's important to understand that an addiction always meets an emotional need. So the question we need to ask is, what emotional needs do our kids need to be met, and how can we meet those? So aggression, video games and aggression. So there's been a lot of debate over the last 30 years about whether video games foster aggression in kids or not. So there's been 30 years, and thousands of studies, and basically the verdict is in: exposure to violent media in general causes aggression. Video games have the highest and strongest effect because you are an actor in the action. And the high levels of dopamine. So, as I said, dopamine accelerates learning. Anything that's got a high amount of dopamine associated with it, your brain remembers. So when you're committing acts of violence in the virtual world, and amidst these high levels of dopamine, you're actually learning at an incredible rate. So there's porn and video games as well, as Lisa mentioned earlier, and that all ties into this. So, and this connects to the other thing I was mentioning earlier. There's these mirror neurons in our brains. Children are just rife with mirror neurons because this is how they learn about the world. They do what they see. So that applies to porn, and that applies to video games. So this does absolutely affect their. I think there was one person who put out one study that said that there was no causal effect, and that's because they tied it to a drop in violence in the United States, but that was actually attributable to improving the gang situation in the States. It had actually nothing to do. A lot of the aggression, not all the aggression, is something that the police are getting involved with. A lot of it is just bullying, even verbal aggression in the home that doesn't ever get reported. So the severity of the effect will vary depending on the level of violence they've been exposed to. The personality and biological factors, some people are more predisposed to it. So the really extreme cases you hear about in the news, it wasn't caused by video games, but video games were a factor that accelerated it. The amount of exposure. So when our boys were young, we kept cutting back their game time because they were miserable. They were always asking for it. And eventually we cut it back to like a half an hour in the morning on Saturday and a half an hour in the afternoon on Saturday, and maybe half an hour on Sunday. And that was it that they got during the week. And that was all their screen time. And suddenly they were happy again. And it was this weird effect, but we just kept cutting it back because they were obviously miserable. They were just asking for it all the time. And they hit this point and suddenly they were happy and well adjusted again. So the amount of exposure is really important. Personalization plays a factor. So the more invested they are in a game, the more they personalized it, they created their own avatar, the more they identify with that character on the screen. And then there's also all kinds of social factors and the age of the child. Younger children are more likely to pick up aggression. So I'll just quickly, there was a brain study done in the States, and the guy studied non-gamer college students. And he scanned their brains, and then he introduced them to a week of heavy playing of violent video games, and then he scanned their brains again, and he could see the change in the brain from 1 week of regular playing. So you can imagine if somebody's playing week after week, month after month. So I talk a little bit about childhood development with respect to this stuff. So autism has risen 800%, rose 800% between 1980 and 2017. Pediatric bipolar disorder rose 4,000% between 1994 and 2003. And this got a researcher named Victoria Dunkley looking for an environmental, what she called an environmental stressor. She's like, what's going on? Like, this can't just be happening spontaneously. And after a large amount of research, she settled on this. She called electronic screen syndrome, or ESS. And that the unnaturally stimulating nature of an electronic screen, regardless of content, wreaks havoc on the still developing nervous system and mental health of a child. And that's cognitive, behavioral, and emotional. And so when she was talking about all screens stimulating, that was TV, movies, computers, phones, tablets, game consoles. Anything that's got a screen in it produces dopamine. It's actually possible to become addicted to word processing, I understand, but yeah.
I find this interesting because schools at the moment are moving more and more.
Yep, I'll get to that.
You are.
Yep. But I have to keep going fast. So electronic screen syndrome. So interacting with screens overstimulates a child. The brain goes into fight or flight mode, causes dysregulation and disorganization of various biological and hormonal systems. And this can exacerbate or lead to disorders such as ADHD, depression, oppositional defiant disorder, and anxiety. So what's been found in these studies is that all children are affected to some degree. Even moderate screen exposure can cause subtle damage. And what that's going to look like in kids is chronic irritability, inability to focus, general malaise, apathy, or this being wired and tired at the same time. Like they can't rest, can't sleep, but they're exhausted and they're all wound up. So this leads to a question of how much is okay. For children of age 1 to 3, each hour of screen time they have on a regular basis has been linked to about a 10% increase chance of them developing a serious attention disorder. So the recommended screen time for ages 1 to 3 is none. And it's tough, but it seems like such a good babysitter, but for older kids, some experts say 1 to 2 hours a day, but again, one of the researchers said, my feeling is that 2 hours is too much. So that was our experience with our kids. We cut them back a lot. So that begs the question, how much screen time are our kids getting? Yeah, so when I talk screen time, TV, computers, tablets, the whole works, yeah. So how much screen time are kids getting now? Kids spend between 8 and 18 spend about 7.5 hours a day in front of a screen on average. Computer, television, other electronic device. That doesn't include the average 1.5 hours they spend a day texting or the half an hour they spend talking on the phone. So that adds up to the majority of a kid's waking life. So obviously, given what I'm talking about, that's not really recommended. So when you condition the mind to become accustomed to such high levels of input, there's a chance that reality can just become boring. And that leads to a condition we call anhedonia, which is this complete lack of feeling, complete inability to get excited about anything. And that's where this self-harming epidemic comes from, is these kids that are just completely numbed out. So I'm going to keep rolling here, though. So this is the educational bit. So, but computers are educational, right? Not so much. So, and like, I'm a computer programmer, and I grew up with computers. So if I'm telling you this, I love computers, but billions of dollars have been spent around the world. There was a school district in LA that spent $1.3 billion just in their district alone, getting every kid an iPad. And the studies came in, and they just showed a slight degradation academic result. No real gain. And what it showed is that technology amplifies. So some of the best students were able to use the technology to do a bit better, but the worst students got amplified into being even worse. It took their distractibility and it amplified it. So we got a quote here from Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. I probably spearheaded giving away more computer equipment to schools than anybody on the planet, but I've come to the conclusion that the problem is not one that technology can hope to solve. What's wrong with education cannot be fixed with technology. No amount of technology will make a dent. So, a slideshow? Yeah. Yep. That quote came out of this book, Glow Kids. Yeah. So I recommend you grab a copy of that. Yeah. Oh, and Steve. So also Steve Jobs. So a reporter asked him after the release of the iPad, "Your kids must be loving this thing," and his response was, "My kids have never used it. We limit the amount of technology we allow our kids to have." So you got to be careful about what Silicon Valley is selling you. So, will my kid fall behind if I don't let them have access to technology? So we hear that concern from parents. It's a very technologically driven world. So these are some faces of some people you may have heard of: Sergey Brin, Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, and Jimmy Wales. They are the founders of Google, Amazon, and Wikipedia. And what do these guys have in common? They all went to a Montessori school that had no technology. So, one of the best things my parents did for me is during most of my formative years in childhood, every weekend in the summer they took me away to an island in northern Canada that had no electricity. So, I'm winding up really quickly here. So I'm going to talk about some solutions. There's a handout that you'll be getting at the end that has a lot of this in more detail. I'm just going to talk a quick bit because I like my brain science. So we've talked a lot about dopamine today. There's another neurotransmitter called serotonin that's also very important to us. And the basic gist of it is that dopamine is about pleasure, things that are short-lived, visceral, and you can achieve them by eating something, taking something, playing a game. Then they're addictive, and they're typically something experienced alone. Serotonin, on the other hand, and dopamine is about, that was really great, give me more. Serotonin, on the other hand, is about, that was really great, I'm completely satisfied. And that's a long-lived feeling. It's kind of ethereal. It's more about giving than it is about taking. You can't achieve it with substances. You can't buy it. So that's why it hasn't been promoted in Western societies, because you can't make money off of it. It's not addictive. In fact, serotonin ends up stopping things from happening in your brain rather than causing things to happen. So it's not addictive. And it's something that is typically experienced together. Serotonin is usually a shared experience. So one of the strategies that you want to do is find ways to bring your serotonin up and your dopamine down. Because one of the important points here is that dopamine in large quantities prevents you from using your serotonin in your system. So a lot of pleasure actually makes it impossible for you to feel happy and at peace. So that's kind of the lie of addiction. So some other solutions this leads to is less screen time, none for kids age 1 to 3, so reiterating that. No screens 2 hours before bed, because screens are very excitatory. So if you want your kids to sleep, anybody, I recommend this for adults as well, is turn off all your screens 2 hours before bed. More relational time. Like, we have a almost 15-year-old daughter. We still read books as a family. So there's some great classics out there that are wonderful. So we spend a lot of time together doing stuff like that. More sports and hobbies. And in extreme cases, that'll be on the handout as well. If you've got a kid that's truly addicted, then a tech fast is recommended for about 4 to 6 weeks. It takes for the system to completely reset, and it's recommended to wean off that slowly over about a period of about a week. So some of this stuff about serotonin and dopamine, if you want to learn more about that, there are some YouTube videos and a book by a guy, Dr. Lustig, and his material is called The Hacking of the American Mind, but it wasn't just the American mind, it was the Western mind. But he's done some of the research into dopamine blocking serotonin. And as I indicated earlier, a lot of the material for this presentation, the research is collected by Nicholas Kardaras in this Glow Kids book. And so if you want to learn more about any of this, I will warn you there are some graphic sections around the extreme cases around game violence and online bullying. You may want to skip those sections if you're sensitive. Anyway, that's about it. 10 after 9, landed this sucker on time so that we have some time for some questions. So feel free